Awesome. Tonight we have Caroline Ouwerkerk speaking, who was also class of 2005, one of the best classes, a little biased. And after graduating from Hill, Caroline received her BA from University of Chicago and a master's from Penn. And she ran a Center for Urban Research at U Chicago and also student civic engagement programs at Hopkins, and then left to create her own business. And Caroline is now a career and confidence coach, which is awesome. Give me your number after this. And working with clients everywhere, specializing in social impact careers and overcoming imposter syndromes, which sounds very interesting. So Caroline, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Well, I'm very excited to be joining tonight. Like Lindsay mentioned, I was at the Hill for all 4 years of high school. I was a day student for 2 years. I was a boarder for 2 years. And the Hill is a family tradition. Both of my American great-grandparents went to Hill, great-grandfathers went to Hill, and so did my brother. So and my great-uncle, but so kind of all in the family. But I'm really excited to be here because one of the things that I really want to talk about tonight is about the mindset shift that sort of changed my life, and with the hope that some of what I am sharing today can help others think about their direction and move through their careers with more intention and feel a little bit more settled about what it is that they're doing. So like Lindsay mentioned, I graduated Hill in 2005 and went to the University of Chicago, where I majored in history. And then I spent a year at Penn getting my master's, and then came back right to the University of Chicago, where I started this research center focusing on urban history. And I was there for about 4 years, running research conferences, getting faculty connected on different urban research topics, and really trying to grow the center. But basically around 2015, I realized that although what I was doing was really interesting, it wasn't really what I wanted to be spending my time doing. And so I made the move to working directly with students at Hopkins, where I was running community service programs and social justice programs for undergraduate students. And then in 2019, I really had that shift again, where I decided that my favorite part of my job, I wanted to be doing that more often. And that was working with graduating seniors who were trying to figure out what it is that they wanted to do with their lives. And so basically I would see students all the time where they would come in, the week before graduation, just in a flurry, stressed about, holy moly, I'm graduating next week and I have no idea what I want to do with my life. And I really enjoyed those conversations with helping people try to figure out, what it is that they want to do. And that's sort of the niche that I've really gotten myself into now with my career coaching practice. And so I work with mostly young professionals who are about 2 to 12 years out of college in a variety of different industries. So everything from tech to construction recruiting to kind of everything in between. I have a lot of folks working in nonprofits and social impact, but it's a really diverse group of people, and they're located all around the world, which is, I think, really cool. So I've got folks in I think I was up to 7 different countries the last time I added it, on 3 different continents. So I'm pretty excited to get the chance to talk to people from around the world. But one of the things that I think is super interesting is that the traditional career advice that we get, it begins with this idea of what do you want to do? What are your goals? What's that job you're trying to get to? Or my favorite, people tell you, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that really makes you come alive? I hate that phrase of, discover your passion, do what you're passionate about. It drives me bananas because it's not particularly helpful in terms of actually explaining to you how you find your passion. So often there's this idea that, I get this mental image in my head of, your passion, there's like a master list of passions out there, and you kind of have to just do process of elimination to figure out oh, that's the one I'm passionate about. And that just doesn't seem particularly efficient or fruitful. And it leaves a lot of people just kind of stumbling around, wondering what it is that they're actually passionate about and wondering if they're doing the wrong thing because they haven't figured out what it is that they're passionate about. Traditional career advice also often talks about this idea of, setting a goal, figuring out what it is that you want to do and kind of reverse engineering it. Like as if your life is a giant board game of the game of life, and you just have to keep, doing what it is you're supposed to do and just keep moving around the board until you get to the point where you've found the job that you wanted and magical things happen. I again find that to be a really challenging mental image, because it makes it feel like if you do all of these steps in exactly the right order, you'll get to exactly where you're trying to go. And that's just not accurate for most people. Or traditional career advice talks about optimizing your resume and figuring out, the magical set of words to perfectly format your cover letter, or optimizing your LinkedIn, or figuring out how to get through all of these computer systems that read your resume before you actually, before a human does. And while that's helpful, you do need to get through those applicant tracking systems. You do need to get through LinkedIn. You do need to do some of those things. It doesn't really help you get at this idea of what it is that you actually want to do. We default to a lot of what I often call these Barbie doll jobs, right? So this idea of like, there was a Barbie that was wearing that outfit, and so that's why you know that it's a job that people do, right? So, doctor, lawyer, business person, professor, teacher, there's all these jobs out there, that we know what that job is called, right? But I think that's a really challenging notion, because you might have two people who both have lawyer on their business card, but they're doing very, very different things, right? So Alicia Florrick on The Good Wife is walking around Chicago in a power suit doing all kinds of, really cool cases. And she's got lawyer on her business card, right? But then someone else might be sitting in a church basement helping someone fill out all of the paperwork to become a US citizen. And they're also doing really interesting, exciting work. And they also have lawyer on their business card, right? But when you say lawyer, we could be talking about these two totally different images of what it is that people do, right? And so one of the things that I think is really challenging about traditional career advice is this idea of we don't actually surface what it is we're talking about when we say these words about what it is that we're doing, right? So one of the things that I think is super helpful is getting to this point of what is it that you actually want to do, right? And when I work with folks, I like to think about it as, what is it that you want to do next? Because my understanding is that until you get really, really comfortable with your why, for why this next step makes sense for you, you're going to continue to feel unsettled, right? So to give an example, my first job out of grad school, like I mentioned, was running this research center at the University of Chicago. And one of the biggest parts of my job there was planning conferences. So I planned a million conferences. It was an exponential curve. So the first year I did one conference. The second year I did 2 conferences. The third year I did 4 conferences, and it just kept growing from there. And one of the challenges was that I was really good at running conferences. I'm very detail oriented. I could keep a lot of different, balls in the air and know exactly what needs to happen when, and, organize the whole process. So I was good at organizing conferences, which meant that I kept getting more conferences to organize. And what I realized was that I actually cannot stand organizing conferences. So basically one day after a really tough day at work, I took a bunch of Post-it notes and I put them on my desk, and I said, okay, I'm good at this, but I hate doing it, right? And I made another Post-it note that was like, what am I good at and actually like doing, right? What am I not good at but like doing? And what am I not good at and don't like doing, right? And I realized at the time that my entire job description fit on this Post-it note of good at, but don't like doing, right? And it sounds so simple, but there's this, I finally realized, right, that just because you're good at something doesn't mean you have to do it, right? But one of the challenges of that is that we spend a lot of time telling young people, or well, all people actually, you know, that, oh, you're good at that, you should do this, right? You're good at science, you should become a doctor. Or, you know, you're really good at arguing, you should become a lawyer. Or you're good at that, you know, and we name a trait and we give them a job, right? And we just kind of mash it together and say, you should do this, right? To be fair, in my case, no one said, oh, you're good at organizing conferences, you should become a higher ed administrator, because I'd never heard of that job before I went to grad school for it. But, you know, the concept is the same in terms of, you're good at this, you should do more of it. But we don't often take a step back to realize, like, do we actually like doing that work, right? So the mindset shift here is around this idea of, you know, just because you're good at something, it doesn't mean you have to do it. But it goes broader than that, which is around interpreting your own lived experience and being comfortable with understanding your own experience as something that's valid. And so what I mean by that is, we spend our entire lives in the educational system, you know, is like from the moment that we're born to basically the day we graduate college, mastering content and doing things in a particular order, right? So you go to school, you read on time, you get promoted to first grade, then you do this stuff and you get promoted to second grade, and then you keep going up, and there's always a next step, right? There's always a next thing that's coming that you're supposed to be doing, right? But then what happens is that you graduate from college and all bets are off, right? You can do anything, but you can't do everything. And so that's why that's why my clients are all 2 years out of college, where they went into the first thing that they were supposed to be, that they felt like they should be doing. And then they're coming back and they're like, actually, I don't really like this, right? So those are the conversations that I end up having with people all the time, right? So it's the shift from the educational system of mastering content, right? So we learn there's a set of content on the curriculum, we master this syllabus, and then we pass the class, right? We master this set of content and we pass the grade. We master this set of content, we get a bachelor's degree, right? It's all about, this is what you're supposed to master, you do it, and then you move on, right? Different places do this to, you know, different levels, right? You know, Hill definitely taught me how to think and how to write and how to exceed expectations on that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, you're still in this space of, there are faculty members who are giving you grades and you are giving papers and you get a grade and you move on, right? But the challenge is that that's not how the rest of the world works, right? And so when you graduate, all of a sudden all bets are off. And so it becomes really challenging to figure out if you're on the right track, if you're doing it right. And so a lot of people tend to, you know, to get out into the working world and just feel really lost, especially if they've kind of come from this. I work with a lot of people who are really high achievers. So they've kind of always done everything the way that they were supposed to, you know, their entire lives. I'm a recovering high achiever myself, you know, and it's like, this is what I was supposed to do. I've done it, and now what, right? And so you get to this point where you're trying to figure out what it is that I'm supposed to do. So the shift comes from going from this space of mastering content to what we call experiential learning. So it's a completely different approach to learning about the world, right? So in experiential learning, we've all had exposure to this. You know, it's very similar to the scientific method, where you've got a hypothesis, you do an experiment, you reflect on the experiment and figure out what worked and what didn't work, and then you do a new experiment, right? And you keep iterating forward. That's how we've developed every scientific discovery that's ever been out there. It has been through having some sort of hunch about something, testing your hunch, making interpreting the data and iterating forward, right? That's what we call the experimental method. When we apply it to learning from lived experience, it's called experiential learning. And I think that this is the most important, the most important thing that I've certainly learned as an adult is how do we make meaning from lived experience, and how do we trust in ourselves and our own interpretation? How do we go from this mindset of there is an answer, it's out there, I just need to find it, to there's lots of different answers and I need to figure out which one, like I just need to pick one, right? There's no right answer, there are lots of possible answers, and getting comfortable with this with the space of not knowing. It goes back to this idea of thinking about next steps, right? So thinking about this linearity, this linear idea that many of us have of how do we go from, where we are to where we want to be, it shifts that, right? So it reduces this pressure on thinking that there is a perfect next step for you that you need to figure out, and you need to, just need to find it, right? To there are lots of possibilities. You just need to pick a next step. Experiential education, experiential learning is rooted in this idea of clarity coming from action and not thought, right? So this is not something where you can just sit there and just, think through, make a pros and cons list and just, come up with the right answer magically. It comes from you figure out what it is you're trying to do through this process of doing the thing. So it's this shift from getting from point A to point B to what we call more of a wayfinding approach. So this idea that you're moving forward, you encounter an obstacle, and instead of just giving up, right, and saying like, we're done here, right, you figure out how to get around the obstacle, just like you would in real life, if you're on a hike or something. Instead, it's, you pursue something, you run into an obstacle, how do you move around so that you can keep that forward momentum going? So people often ask me, what if I make the wrong choice, right? What if I'm trying to think of what is next and I pick the wrong option? I'm trying to pick between job A and job B and graduate school. Do I want to become a physical therapist, or do I want to work at a bank? What if I pick the wrong thing, right? And one of the things that's really beautiful about approaching this experiential learning mindset, or embracing this experiential learning mindset, is this idea that there is no wrong choice, right? So we're never starting from zero, right? One of the things that's embedded with this idea of the wrong choice is that if you pick wrong, you're going to have to go back to the beginning again, right? But that's just not possible, right? We can't go back in time, unfortunately, but we also are always taking with us the learned experience that we've got, right? So we're always taking that data and using it to iterate onto the next version, right? So it's never starting from zero, because we can't unlearn what we've already learned, right? And sure, at some point, you may realize it might have been more efficient to approach something in a different way. So, this could be at the micro level in terms of, it would have been more efficient if I had started this project in this way instead of that way, but now I'm knee deep in it and I can't, I got to finish what I've started, right? Or it could be macro, right? Picking a job that you find is not actually a good fit for you. But the point is that you have to trust the fact that you're doing what you can, where you all are with the information that you've got at the time, right? And so you can't look back and judge the earlier self with the knowledge that you've got after you've already had that experience, because that's just not realistic. It's not fair, right? You didn't have that at the beginning, and now you have all this data. And so yes, sure, you would have done it differently if you were back at square one again, but you're not, right? You're iterating forward. So it's this idea of continuous momentum in a forward direction. So when I was a sixth former at Hill, in the fall of my sixth form year, I gave a chapel talk in a chapel, not in my office here in Baltimore. And I was one of the first chapels, the first sixth form chapels in September or October. And I remember it very clearly because I was really excited to give a chapel, just like I am now. But I was trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to talk about. And what I ended up talking about was my daily practice of keeping a journal. So I have been keeping a journal almost every single night since December of 1998. So when I spoke in September of my sixth form year, it was 2004. So I'd been doing it for a while by then. I'm still doing it. It's a way of keeping track of sort of what's going on, right? And it's not really about the record keeping or reading the entries per se, although I am a historian and it is nice to go back and reread those entries occasionally. I wrote a diary entry on my second day of college, which is when I met my husband, and we actually used the diary entry as one of the readings at our wedding. So that was cool. But it's not necessarily about the record keeping itself. It's about the process. So we're making meaning from lived experience, right? So we don't learn by doing the thing. We learn from reflecting on doing the thing. So an example of this is there's a pan on the stove, you touch it, you burn yourself. You don't learn from that experience. You learn from taking a step back and saying, why did I burn myself? Oh, it's because I touched a hot pan, right? Like the pain of the pan itself is not what's teaching you. It's processing the data and realizing that it's because the pan was hot. Maybe you shouldn't do that again, right? So sometimes that meaning making is instantaneous. Sometimes it takes a bit more time and analysis, right? So this idea of writing in a journal, there's a lot of power in the marking of the days, of intentionally carving out space to process what's going on, of reflecting and course correcting and learning through writing. I happen to be a person who prefers to do something every day rather than kind of whenever I feel like it, but you can approach this in a lot of different ways. So I'm not necessarily saying you need to start a diary, although there's certainly something to be said for the fact that every productivity or creativity listicle you'll ever find on the internet talks about how anyone who's doing anything, writes first thing every morning. And, if you're not doing morning pages, you're missing out. You have to do what works for you, right? There are lots of different ways to keep a journal. You could keep a diary like I've done in the past. You could write down just one line a day. You could do what I like to call a letter to self, which is before you have some sort of big life event, like starting a new job, having a baby, doing something exciting, you can write yourself a letter and you can choose to open it later, right? So that's a way of capturing the memories. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. You could also talk to someone and kind of have that conversation verbally with a coach or with a friend or something like that. But the bigger point is about taking that time to assess what it is you're doing and how you actually feel about it. To challenge yourself to surface some of the hidden assumptions or beliefs that you've got underneath the surface, right? So it's that process of meaning making, of looking at that information and making an analysis. It's interesting because many of the people who come to work with me are very focused on this idea of identifying the best next step. And so we spend a lot of time reframing this idea to, how are you going to know when you find that best next step? What's it gonna, it's not going to say like, this is the best next step. I mean, what will you need to know about this possibility to make it feel like it's the best next step for you, right? Or put another way, what do you need in order to feel confident about the decision you're making, right? everything is an experiment. So if we approach it that way and understand that everything is able to be corrected, we think instead about, what's the hypothesis that you're trying to test through this next opportunity? When you think about your next job, what do you need to get out of that in order for that to be a helpful test that gives you information that you can keep using to iterate forward? It's really important to also note that you can usually only do one thing at a time, right? So people tend to imagine, okay, there's all these possibilities. And so the way that they tend to approach it is like, okay, well, if I make this choice and it doesn't work out, I can always go back and try this thing instead. But that's not true, right? I mean, it might appear that way, but what you end up doing is you're going you're picking one door, right? So people say, I want to keep all my options open, but that's a kind of false notion, right? Because you're never going to be back in that before state again. You're always carrying further information with you. And so if you try to walk through, this door of possibility, but you're still looking back at all of the other options that you didn't choose, you're not actually going to be making much progress, right? So it's this idea of choosing your choice, right? So making a decision, committing to that decision, and testing it out, and then going through that experiential learning model of figuring out, making meaning from that experience after you've been able to keep moving forward with it, right? Because we run into challenges when we don't allow for that possibility that our priorities have shifted, or that this extra information we've gotten from trying this, this option has helped us to realize that we actually want to go in a different direction. It's absolutely crucial to choose the choice, right? Once you've made this decision, those other options aren't there anymore, and that's okay. It's also really important to take time to process that experience, right? So we often try to combine the experience and the meaning making in sort of one fell swoop and try to do both of them at the same time. But that doesn't tend to give people the space that they need to process what's going on, right? So allowing yourself to have the experience without judgment, and then process and decide whether or not that's the right thing for you, and kind of iterate from there. We tend to close ourselves off from a lot of things because we make assumptions about how things are going to turn out, or we try to think ahead and figure out if we can determine what the outcome of this situation is going to be. But in reality, we don't know because we've never had that experience before, right? So we need that experience for us to learn something. And so that's why we need to test that out and iterate on it. Because you just don't, you can't project forward that way because you haven't had that experience before. I can tell, I can say that, I've had the most success with leaping into things that I'm not completely sure of, right? So I find that when I do deep research about an option that's on the table, it tends to have a diminishing return the more research I do, because it doesn't give enough space to allow for that possibility of the experience and to allow for what that experience is to allow meaning making from that experience, because basically I've just already prejudged what I want to get out of it. So it's really important to take a step back and have the experience and then make meaning from it. So we've talked about a lot of different things, and I think one of the biggest challenges is this mindset shift of going from there's mastering content, of there is only one answer, what is it that you need to know, and approaching these big life decisions as if there's one best way to do it, to getting increasingly more comfortable with things being an experiment, with testing things out, with understanding that there are different lessons to be learned from different experiences, and you can't necessarily assume you know what those lessons are before you go into it. So with that, I would say, wherever you are, whatever crossroads you find yourself at, it's absolutely crucial to take the time to consider the process and to give yourself the space to learn from lived experience and to be comfortable with your own authority, right? So we're all authorities on our own experience, right? And it's really essential to get comfortable with this idea that your interpretation is just as valid, right? There's not a teacher, waiting there to grade you. There's not a one perfect way to interpret a given situation. It's this idea of relying on our own interpretation and being okay with that. So I challenge you to think about, whatever crossroads you're at, how can you reframe this as an experiment? How can you figure out what kind of hypothesis you're trying to test through this opportunity? What can you do to more intentionally choose your choice and actually commit to the decision you're making? How can you surface what it is that you're trying to get out of that experience, whether it's through something like keeping a journal or writing a letter to yourself or just talking about it, right? And saying, this is what I'm actually, this is the hypothesis I'm looking to challenge. How can you start practicing being okay with not knowing what it is that, not knowing if there's a right answer, right? How can you start to learn to be comfortable with this idea that there might be multiple right answers, and whatever answer you pick is the right one for you because that's the one you're picking? I think it's really important to remember that you're in control of the story that you're trying to tell from all of these different experiences. There is no right answer, right? So you can string together the same set of events and tell a completely different interpretation. You control the narrative. And so that is really important when you're putting together the dots of your resume to apply for a job, or it's really important when you put the dots of your experience together to tell your life story, right? So this is you're in charge of the interpretation you make on the experiences that you've had. You live out the story in forward motion, but you explain the narrative in reverse. And so when you think about your next step, all that matters is that you're able to convince yourself that this next step makes sense for you. It doesn't serve you to think 10 steps ahead because you don't know what your 9th step is going to look like, right? You're only making that next step. You're iterating forward, right? So this is obviously something that I care deeply about. So I just want to put the offer out there that if anyone who's watching this wants to learn more or talk further, I would definitely encourage you to reach out. My name is also my website, carolineouwerkerk.com. You can email me also, it's carolineouwerkerk@gmail.com. There are not that many Ouwerkerks out there, so you can find me. You can connect on LinkedIn. You can find me on all the different social networks. I'm on a mission to help people create lives that they're not desperate for a vacation from, where they can leverage their skills and interests to do meaningful work and create space for all of their priorities. And so if any of what I've shared tonight resonates with you, I'd love to talk further about how you can make this meaning from your lived experience and keep iterating forward.
Caroline, I have a question for you before we actually stop recording.
Absolutely.
So in my position at Hill and Shelley's as well, we work with current students in, like different clubs, and Shelley's a dorm parent. I'm a 2-sport coach. And I guess if you were talking to, I don't know, maybe yourself as a Hill senior, or, you're talking to the 5th and 6th formers at Hill right now, kind of knowing your, being able to retell your narrative in backwards motion, like using everything that you know now as a coach, like what is like one piece of advice that you would give to, graduating high school seniors to, I guess, get through college using this like experiential learning and choosing your choice? I know that a lot of the work that you do is with people who've graduated college, but I feel like some of your knowledge would be so helpful for kids who are like just entering college and you know, so I'm curious to know what you would say to them.
Well, first year college students are absolutely something that I love, a population I love working with. And when I was at when I was at Hopkins and the University of Chicago, I ran programs for freshmen all the time. So that is definitely a population that I love working with. So if Hill ever wants to invite me to come speak to the graduating seniors before they go off to college, I'm there. But the advice that I would give really comes down to, if you graduate college with straight A's, you're doing it wrong. Because it means that you're not pushing your limits, right? There's not this idea of testing what it is that you want to do, that you're interested in, right? Because if you're getting straight A's, you've probably taken classes that you know you're going to excel in. So you're not testing out something that is just completely off base because you're so focused on getting these grades, right? It also probably means that you didn't create space for anything outside of your academics, right? And that's just a waste of time. I think that it's absolutely essential to be doing things outside of the classroom. I've been working on a book about maximizing your college experience for several years. And one of the things I talk about there is this idea that college is a sandbox. And it's really a great opportunity. And I'd like to think I'm not that far out of college, but I mean, it's, you know, we're getting up there, right? But this idea that like, it's one time in your life when you have this opportunity to try so many different things with very few consequences. And I think that that's just, it's even more freedom than you have in high school where you're trying to get into college, right? It's this time when you have, 4 or 5, however long it takes you to move through college years, to explore things, to test things out. If there's something out there that piques your curiosity, go for it, right? Even if you can't figure out how it will look on your resume, right? If you are going into everything with this idea of how it's going to show up in your resume later, you're doing it wrong. And a great example of that is this idea of the dots of your life will connect. That comes from a Steve Jobs graduation speech, where he talks about this, what was it, like a typography class that he took in college, where he, like, for whatever reason, had to fill an arts requirement or something. And he took a typography class and learned about how fonts work. And it didn't make any sense at the time. It wasn't connected to his future goals, but eventually it came back, and it's been cited as one of the reasons why Macs have such extensive fonts and are so used in design because it was baked into the system from the beginning. Because when Steve Jobs was sitting down to figure out how to put fonts in the computers, he thought back to this typography class that he had taken in college. So it all kind of comes back, but you just don't necessarily know. And if you kind of go through it with this idea of here's how all these pieces are going to connect, you're closing yourself off to a lot of opportunity. I could clearly talk about that all day long. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Caroline. Your talk was amazing. We're going to sign off to our listeners on YouTube so we can have a more private Q&A. So yeah, thank you so much for speaking, and we hope to see you all at our next chapel talk, which will be on Wednesday, April 14th, same time, 8 o'clock on Zoom.
Nice.